"Get out of the car." The officer screamed, his gun drawn. I was being arrested for a felony hit and run. Across town, my sister and parents were celebrating, certain I'd go to prison for the crash she caused. I let the handcuffs click around my wrists. "Get out of the car." The officer screamed, his gun. They forgot one tiny detail. "Turn the engine off and drop the keys outside the window. Do it now." The voice didn't just boom through the megaphone. It physically vibrated against the rearview mirror of my sedan. I didn't need to look behind me to know how many of them there were. The interior of my car was completely flooded with a blinding, strobing mixture of crimson and sapphire light. It washed out the dashboard, casting long, jagged shadows across the leather steering wheel. "Show me your hands. Keep them where I can see them." I slowly lifted my hands, pressing my palms flat against the cold glass of the windshield. My pulse was steady. I didn't feel the frantic, suffocating spike of adrenaline that usually accompanies a high-risk felony traffic stop. Instead, a profound, almost clinical sense of clarity washed over my mind. "With your left hand, open the door from the outside. Step out slowly." I rolled down the window. The freezing night air hit my face, carrying the sharp metallic scent of rain on hot asphalt and the heavy hum of 3 idling police cruisers. I pulled the exterior handle and pushed the heavy door open. The gravel crunched loudly under my boots as I stepped out onto the slick highway shoulder. Instantly, 3 high-intensity LED spotlights pinned me to the darkness. I squinted through the glare, making out the silhouettes of 3 officers taking cover behind their open car doors, their service weapons drawn and leveled directly at my chest. The red dot of a laser sight danced erratically over the center of my coat. "Turn around. Interlace your fingers behind your head. Walk backwards toward the sound of my voice." I followed the instructions with the frictionless precision of a ghost. I turned my back to the loaded guns, laced my fingers together, and took slow, measured steps backward. The lead officer didn't wait for me to reach the cruiser. He closed the distance, grabbed my interlaced fingers with a violent, authoritative grip, and slammed my chest hard against the wet, freezing trunk of my own car. The heavy, ratcheting click of Smith & Wesson's steel handcuffs biting into my wrists sounded incredibly loud over the crackle of the police radios. "You're under arrest for a felony hit-and-run resulting in severe bodily injury," the officer growled into my ear, his breath hot against my neck as he aggressively patted down my coat pockets for a weapon. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As he recited the Miranda warning, reciting the exact legal poetry of my destruction, I didn't close my eyes. I stared at the rain streaking across the taillights of my car, and I thought about my younger sister, Harper. Harper was the golden child. For 26 years, she had been a reckless, destructive force of nature, and for 26 years my parents, Richard and Diane, had been her dedicated cleanup crew. When Harper failed out of college, they blamed the professors. When Harper totaled her first car driving drunk at 19, my father hired the most ruthless defense attorney in the state to get the DUI expunged, paying the fees by quietly draining the college fund my grandparents had left for me. I was the independent one, the quiet one, the one who moved 3 states away, built an ironclad career as a senior data analyst for a private logistics firm, and permanently insulated myself from their toxic, enabling chaos until 3 days ago. My mother had orchestrated a family reconciliation dinner at a high-end restaurant downtown. She claimed they missed me, that Harper had finally matured and was getting her life together before her upcoming wedding to the heir of a local real estate empire. I should have known better. During the dinner, Harper had hugged me tightly, crying theatrical tears onto my shoulder. She wasn't apologizing. She was pickpocketing my spare driver's license from the interior pocket of my trench coat. Tonight, at exactly 9:04 p.m., Harper had gotten behind the wheel of her fiancé's heavy SUV, completely intoxicated, when T-boned a civilian minivan at a 4-way intersection. She didn't stick around to check if the family inside the crushed metal was breathing. She fled on foot. But before she ran into the dark, she executed a masterpiece of familial betrayal. She tossed my stolen driver's license onto the driver's side floorboard. 10 minutes later, my mother called the precinct from an anonymous burner phone, reporting that she had seen a woman matching my exact description, driving erratically near the crash site. They weren't just covering up Harper's mistake this time. They were actively framing me. They were sacrificing my freedom, my spotless criminal record, and my career so that Harper's $1 million wedding wouldn't be ruined by a 10-year prison sentence. Right now, across town, the three of them were likely sitting in my parents' sprawling living room, drinking Cabernet, shaking with relief, entirely certain that the police had just locked the cage around their perfect scapegoat. The officer finished his pat down, grabbed me by the biceps, and spun me around to face him. He was young, his face tight with disgust, looking at me like I was a monster who had just left an innocent family bleeding out on the asphalt. "Do you understand the rights I have just read to you?" he demanded. He was waiting for me to panic. He was waiting for me to cry, to hyperventilate, to scream that it was my sister, to beg him to believe a wild story about a stolen ID and a setup. He was waiting for the chaotic, messy reaction of a guilty hit-and-run driver, realizing their life was over. I didn't do any of those things. The rain hit my face. The red and blue lights painted the wet pavement in violent, flashing colors. And standing there, in the freezing cold, securely handcuffed at gunpoint, facing a 10-year mandatory minimum sentence, I smiled. It wasn't a crazy smile. It was the terrifying, quiet smile of a chess player who just watched their opponent confidently walk their king right onto a landmine. Because my family had spent days meticulously crafting a flawless physical frame job, but they were deeply, incredibly ignorant about the exact nature of what a senior data analyst actually does for a living. The molded, hard plastic back seat of the police cruiser was specifically engineered for maximum physical discomfort. With my hands tightly cuffed behind my back, every pothole and sharp turn on the 20-minute ride to the precinct sent a rigid, bruising shockwave up my spine. I didn't shift. I didn't complain about the cuffs cutting off the circulation to my wrists. I stared out the wire mesh window, watching the blurred neon signs of the city bleed through the raindrops, streaking across the glass. In a bizarre, almost terrifying way, my mind felt like a perfectly calibrated machine. The initial shock of the betrayal had entirely evaporated, replaced by a cold, surgical hyperfocus. My parents and Harper had orchestrated a physical frame job, relying on the blunt force mechanics of the criminal justice system to crush me before I could speak. They assumed the police would arrest me, lock me in a holding cell for the weekend, and by Monday morning, a public defender would be pressuring me to take a plea deal. They fundamentally misunderstood the battlefield. They thought this was a game of physical evidence. They didn't realize that in the modern world, physical evidence is nothing but a shadow cast by digital architecture. And I was the architect. The cruiser violently lurched to a halt inside the subterranean parking garage of the central precinct. The heavy door was yanked open, and the arresting officer hauled me out by the bicep. The transition from the freezing night air to the suffocating, heavily air-conditioned atmosphere of the precinct was jarring. The air smelled of stale coffee, industrial floor bleach, and the sharp metallic tang of adrenaline and sweat. I was marched through the chaotic bullpen. Phones were ringing off the hook, keyboards were clattering, and uniformed officers were shouting over the din. None of them looked at me with curiosity. To them, where I wasn't a complex human being with a story, I was a file number. I was the monster who had T-boned a family minivan, shattered a civilian's collarbone, and cowardly fled the scene into the dark. I could feel the hostility radiating from the desks as I was paraded past them. They didn't put me in a general holding cell. Because the hit and run involved severe bodily injury, it was a high-priority felony. They walked me straight into the Violent Crimes Division and shoved me into Interrogation Room B. The room was a textbook example of psychological deprivation. It was a claustrophobic, windowless concrete box painted in a nauseating institutional shade of off-white. A single violently bright fluorescent tube buzzed angrily overhead. In the center of the room was a bolted-down steel table with two heavily scuffed aluminum chairs. One entire wall was dominated by a massive, perfectly clean two-way mirror. The officer pushed me into the chair furthest from the door. He unhooked my handcuffs, only to immediately recuff my right wrist to a heavy iron ring welded directly to the center of the steel table. "Sit tight," he muttered, not making eye contact. The heavy metal door slammed shut behind him. The deadbolt engaged with a loud, final clack. Then the waiting game began. This is standard police procedure. It's designed to let the isolation and the ticking clock erode the suspect's sanity. They leave you alone in the freezing room so your imagination can torture you with visions of a prison sentence, breaking your psychological defenses before the detective even walks through the door. But I didn't panic. I didn't cry. And I didn't stare anxiously at the two-way mirror. I sat perfectly still, regulating my breathing, dropping my resting heart rate back to a baseline of 60 beats per minute. I mentally mapped out the exact network architecture of the local cellular towers, the GPS refresh rates of modern luxury SUVs, and the biometric syncing protocols of my personal devices. I was building the gallows for my family, line by line of code in my head. 45 minutes later, the deadbolt snapped open. A man in a cheap, rumpled gray suit walked in, carrying a thick manila folder and a styrofoam cup of black coffee. He had dark circles under his eyes, and the exhausted, cynical posture of a man who had spent 20 years listening to guilty people lie to his face. He didn't introduce himself. He pulled out the chair opposite me, the metal legs screeching harshly against the linoleum floor, and sat down. He tossed the manila folder onto the center of the table. "I'm Detective Vance," he said, his voice a low, gravelly monotone. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes fixed on me, like a predator assessing a wounded animal. "You want to tell me why you're sitting in my precinct tonight, Maya?" "I imagine you're going to tell me, Detective," I replied, my voice completely level, stripped of any emotion or tremor. Vance's jaw tightened. He didn't like the absolute lack of fear in my eyes. It broke the script he was used to. He flipped the manila folder open. At 9:04 p.m. tonight, a black luxury SUV blew through a red light at the intersection of 4th and Elm, Vance stated, leaning forward, invading my physical space. It T-boned a Honda Odyssey carrying a family of 4. The mother is currently in surgery with a punctured lung. The driver of the SUV didn't even tap the brakes. They hit the gas, drove 2 blocks until the radiator blew, and then abandoned the vehicle, fleeing on foot into the residential alleys. He reached into the folder and pulled out a heavy plastic evidence bag. He slapped it down onto the steel table right in front of me. Inside the bag was my state-issued driver's license. "The responding officers found this resting on the driver's side floorboard," Vance said, his voice dropping into a harsh, accusatory whisper. 10 minutes later, we received an anonymous 911 call from a concerned citizen who saw a woman, matching your exact description, sprinting away from the crash site. We ran the plates on the SUV. It's registered to a local real estate firm, the exact same firm your sister's fiancé owns. Your family connection to the vehicle is undeniable." Vance leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. He had laid out the trap. Now he was waiting for me to step into it. "We have your ID. We have an eyewitness. We have the vehicle," Vance continued, shifting into the sympathetic cop routine. "I know how it happens, Maya. You had a few too many drinks. You made a mistake. You panicked. If you confess right now, if you show remorse, the district attorney might drop the maximum sentence. If you lie to me and make me hunt down the street camera footage to prove it, I will personally make sure you serve the full 10 years for almost killing that family." He stopped talking. The room went dead silent, except for the angry buzzing of the fluorescent light above us. He expected me to demand a lawyer. He expected me to scream that my sister stole the ID. He expected a messy, chaotic defense that he could easily tear apart. I looked at the evidence bag containing my driver's license. Then I slowly raised my eyes and locked onto Vance's gaze with a level of cold clinical detachment that made him physically flinch. "That is a beautifully constructed narrative, Detective Vance," I said softly, the silence of the room amplifying every single syllable. "It's compelling. It's neat. But structurally, it is a catastrophic failure. You don't have a hit-and-run case sitting in front of you. You have a massive, coordinated conspiracy to commit perjury, frame an innocent civilian, and obstruct a federal investigation," Vance scoffed, shaking his head. "Save the conspiracy theories for your public defender." "I don't need a public defender." I cut him off, my voice dropping an octave, carrying the absolute uncompromising weight of a senior data analyst about to dissect a flawed system. "I need you to open the cardboard box containing the personal effects your officers confiscated from my coat pockets when I was arrested. Because inside that box is my encrypted smartphone. And the second you hand it to me, I am going to give you the exact GPS coordinates, the biometric heart rate data, and the real-time cellular triangulation of the 3 felons who actually orchestrated that crash." Detective Vance didn't laugh. He didn't slam his hands on the table. He just stared at me, the styrofoam coffee cup frozen halfway to his mouth. The heavy, cynical superiority that he had walked into the room with was suddenly suspended, entirely paralyzed by the absolute lack of fear in my posture. In his 20 years on the force, he had interrogated murderers, gang enforcers, and white-collar embezzlers. They all had a tell, a twitch of the jaw, a slight tremor in the voice, a desperate need to over-explain. I wasn't giving him a defense. I was giving him a hostile takeover. You think I'm going to hand a felony suspect their unsearched, unwarranted personal device in the middle of a homicide-adjacent interrogation? Vance asked, his voice dropping into a dangerous, gravelly register. He set the coffee down. I think you are a pragmatist detective, I replied, the fluorescent light buzzing angrily above us, casting sharp clinical shadows across the steel table. And you have a severely injured mother in the ICU, a destroyed civilian vehicle, and a district attorney who is going to want a watertight conviction by sunrise. You can either spend the next 6 months subpoenaing Apple, fighting my lawyers for cloud decryption keys, and praying your circumstantial eyewitness holds up in cross-examination. Or, you can unlock my right hand, hand me the plastic bin sitting in your evidence locker, and let me solve your case in the next 4 minutes. Vance looked at the two-way mirror. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was silently consulting the unseen commanding officer, standing in the dark observation room on the other side of the glass. The silence stretched. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. The tension in the claustrophobic concrete box was thick enough to suffocate on. Finally, Vance pushed his chair back. The metal leg shrieked violently against the linoleum. He didn't say a word. He walked to the heavy iron door, knocked twice, and waited for the deadbolt to disengage. He stepped out. 2 minutes later, he returned. He was carrying a clear, hard plastic evidence bin. Inside it was my trench coat, my keys, my wallet, and my matte black, enterprise-grade smartphone. He set the bin on the table, pulled a small silver key from his belt, and unlocked the heavy Smith & Wesson cuff binding my right wrist to the table ring. I am watching your screen, Vance warned, pulling his chair so close that our knees almost touched. You don't open a messaging app. You don't make a call. You do anything other than what you just promised, and you lose the phone, and I book you for the maximum. I didn't acknowledge the threat. I didn't massage my bruised wrist. I reached into the bin, picked up the cold, heavy device, and pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. The screen flared to life, casting a sharp, bluish glow across the sterile white walls of the interrogation room. Your crash occurred at exactly 9:04 p.m., I stated, my voice slipping into the clinical, frictionless cadence I used when presenting quarterly risk assessments to corporate boards. I tapped an encrypted health monitoring application on my home screen. The human body reacts to a high-speed, automotive collision with a massive, unavoidable surge of cortisol and adrenaline. Heart rates spike to over 140 beats per minute. Blood pressure skyrockets. I turned the phone around, sliding it across the steel table so it sat directly under Vance's nose. Some on the screen was a highly detailed, minute-by-minute line graph generated by my synced smartwatch, the exact same smartwatch that was currently strapped to my left wrist. At 9:04 p.m. tonight, Detective, my heart rate was a steady, resting 58 beats per minute, I said smoothly. My respiratory rate was 12 breaths per minute, and my device's internal GPS was statically pinging my apartment's private Wi-Fi router, exactly 12 miles away from the intersection of 4th and Elm. I was asleep on my couch. Vance stared at the graph. He didn't blink. He was a veteran cop. He knew that smartwatch telemetry was increasingly being used by the FBI to establish irrefutable alibis in homicide cases. It wasn't just data. It was biological perjury prevention. Unless you are suggesting, Detective, that I managed to T-bone a minivan at 60 miles an hour while remaining in a medically induced coma, you are currently holding the wrong suspect, I added, my tone merciless. Vance swallowed hard. He looked up from the screen, his eyes narrowing. That proves you weren't physically driving. It doesn't explain how your physical driver's license ended up on the floorboard of the suspect vehicle. No, I agreed, pulling the phone back toward me. It doesn't, but the vehicle itself is going to explain that. My fingers flew across the digital keyboard with surgical precision. I bypassed my standard apps and opened a secured, two-factor authenticated enterprise gateway. You ran the plates on the suspect SUV, I continued, speaking as I typed. You know it's registered to a local commercial real estate firm, when what you don't know is that my private logistics company holds the exclusive multi-million-dollar contract to manage the telematics and geofencing for their entire corporate fleet. Vance's posture visibly stiffened. The realization of what I was saying and what I had access to began to wash over him like ice water. I bypassed the security firewall, accessed the raw back-end server logs for the real estate firm's fleet, and filtered the database by the specific VIN number of the wrecked SUV. A massive wall of raw, unformatted code flooded my screen. Modern luxury SUVs are not just cars, detective. They are rolling 3-ton data servers, I explained, translating the raw code into a clean, readable dashboard interface. I turned the phone back to him. At exactly 913 and 42 seconds, the vehicle's onboard computer registered a catastrophic, hard-to-braking event. 2 seconds later, the frontal airbag deployment sensor triggered. But I don't care about the collision telemetry. I care about the primary cabin sensors. I tapped a specific line of code, highlighted in yellow. To prevent airbags from deploying and killing children, the passenger and driver seats are equipped with highly calibrated weight sensors, I said, leaning over the table, my voice dropping into an icy absolute whisper. At the moment of impact, the driver's seat weight sensor registered exactly 115 pounds of kinetic mass. I am 5'9", detective, and I weigh 142 pounds. But my younger sister, Harper, who is currently engaged to the heir of the real estate firm that owns that exact truck, or is 5'2" and weighs exactly 115 pounds. Vance completely stopped moving. The styrofoam cup of coffee in his hand crinkled slightly under his tightening grip. His career-making felony case was disintegrating right in front of his eyes, replaced by something much darker and far more complex. She stole my ID 3 days ago at a family dinner, I said, delivering the final blow with ruthless precision. She drove drunk, she crushed that family, and she planted my license to save her upcoming wedding. But planting the ID wasn't enough to guarantee I'd take the fall. They needed to force your hand. They needed to make sure you arrested me before I could establish an alibi. I took the phone back one last time. You mentioned you received an anonymous 911 call from a concerned citizen 10 minutes after the crash, I said, my fingers flying across the screen, accessing a completely different set of data architectures. Let's find out exactly where that concerned citizen was sitting when they decided to ruin my life, shall we? Detective Vance didn't say a word. He didn't interrupt. And he didn't reach for his styrofoam cup of coffee. He simply stared at the illuminated screen of my smartphone, watching his entire neatly packaged hit-and-run investigation shatter into 1,000 irreconcilable pieces of data. In the span of 4 minutes, I had systematically dismantled the physical evidence. But dismantling the trap wasn't enough. I needed to incinerate the people who said it. Now, you said you received an anonymous tip 10 minutes after the collision, I stated, my voice completely devoid of the panic or desperation that usually echoed off the concrete walls of this room. I minimized the logistics server and opened a commercial telecom application. An eyewitness who claimed they saw a woman matching my exact physical description, fleeing the wreckage on foot. I didn't wait for him to confirm. My thumbs moved across the digital keyboard, bypassing the standard consumer login screen, and entering a 2-factor administrative portal for a major national cellular provider. For the last 5 years, my parents, Richard and Diane, have refused to pay their own cellular bills. I explained, delivering the biographical context with the same clinical detachment as the server logs. To avoid the constant arguments, I migrated their numbers onto my corporate enterprise plan. I am the primary account holder, the billing administrator, and the legal owner of the devices they carry. The interface loaded, displaying a highly detailed real-time dashboard of 4 active cellular numbers. I selected the line registered to my mother, Diane. Under the Patriot Act and standard telecommunications compliance, all enterprise accounts log exact timestamp data, duration, and the receiving numbers of outgoing calls directly to the master server, I said. I filtered the daily call log, isolating the data from 9 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. I turned the phone back toward Vance, pushing it precisely to the center of the steel table. Look at the 3rd line down, detective, I instructed softly. Vance leaned over the table, his eyes narrowing as he read the glowing text, and his jaw visibly tightened, the muscles in his neck strained against his rumpled collar. At exactly 9:04 p.m., Precisely 10 minutes after the frontal airbags deployed in the SUV, my mother's phone had initiated an outgoing call. The receiving number was listed simply as 911 Emergency Services. The call duration was 47 seconds. It wasn't an anonymous concerned citizen, I said, my tone dropping into an absolute icy whisper. It was my mother. But that's not the piece of data that's going to put her in a federal penitentiary. I tapped the screen one more time, opening a secondary tab labeled Network Geolocation. A high-resolution satellite map of the city materialized, peppered with overlapping blue circles representing cellular tower triangulation. When you dial 911, the network automatically flags the closest cell tower to route the emergency response, I explained, tracing a perfectly manicured fingernail across the glass screen. The collision occurred at the intersection of 4th and Elm, right in the heart of the downtown grid. But my mother's device didn't ping a downtown tower at 9:04 p.m. It pinged a localized low-frequency node in the middle of Oak Brook Estates, an exclusive gated suburb 12 miles away from the crash site. My mother didn't see me running from the wreckage, Detective Vance, because my mother was sitting in her own living room drinking Cabernet, while she committed felony obstruction of justice, and filed a false police report to frame her oldest daughter. The silence in the interrogation room was no longer just tense. It was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. And the buzzing of the fluorescent tube above us sounded like a chainsaw. Vance finally exhaled. It was a long, slow breath. He ran a heavy hand over his exhausted face. The cynical superiority entirely scrubbed from his posture. He wasn't looking at a suspect anymore. He was looking at the architect of the most airtight conspiracy case his department would see this decade. He reached for the heavy iron ring on the table, picked up the Smith & Wesson handcuffs, and hooked them onto his own belt. "I'm going to dispatch 3 units to Oak Brook Estates right now," Vance said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. The cop in him was boiling over, a mother bleeding out in the ICU, a family destroyed, and the perpetrators were sitting in a gated community trying to pin it on their own blood. "I'm going to rip those doors off the hinges, Maya, when I'm going to book your sister for felony hit and run, and I'm going to book your parents for conspiracy." He stood up, the aluminum chair scraping violently against the floor, and reached for the radio on his shoulder. "Wait," I commanded. I didn't raise my voice, but the absolute surgical authority in my tone froze his hand halfway to the microphone. He looked down at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. "You don't just want an arrest, Detective Vance," I said, leaning back in my chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap. "If you kick their door down right now, Richard will immediately invoke his right to counsel. He will hire a $500 an hour defense attorney. They will claim the phone was hacked. They will claim the SUV was stolen. They will drag this out in court for 3 years, and there is a statistical probability they will confuse a jury enough to walk away with probation." Vance's eyes darkened. "So, what do you suggest, Maya?" "I have the telematics. I have the phone logs. That's enough for a warrant." "You have the metadata," I corrected him smoothly. "But what you really want, what the district attorney wants, is a full uncoerced confession, caught on tape." I picked up my smartphone one last time. When Richard and Diane bought that sprawling estate, they didn't know how to set up the encrypted smart home security network. I said, a terrifying razor-thin smile finally touching the corners of my mouth. So I installed the interior high-definition cameras for them, and they were far too arrogant and far too technologically illiterate to ever ask me to transfer the master administrative privileges. I bypassed the telecom portal and opened a sleek black application. The logo of a premium home security firm flashed on the screen. "They think I'm sitting in a holding cell right now," I whispered, the light from the screen illuminating the cold satisfaction in my eyes. "They think they won. They think the trap snapped shut, which means they are currently sitting in their living room, completely unguarded, discussing exactly how they pulled it off." I tapped the camera feed labeled Main Living Room, Audio Enabled. The screen of my smartphone buffered for a fraction of a second before the encrypted 4K video feed flared to life. The contrast between the sterile, nauseatingly bright interrogation room and the warm or amber-lit luxury of my parents' sprawling Connecticut living room was jarring. The hidden camera nested discreetly inside a digital thermostat on the far wall captured the entire room with flawless wide-angle precision. The audio was pristine, picking up the crackle of the gas fireplace and the heavy, terrified silence of 3 guilty people. Detective Vance leaned in so close I could hear his shallow breathing. His eyes were locked onto the glowing glass. On the screen, my father, Richard, was pacing the length of a massive Persian rug. He was holding a crystal tumbler of scotch. My mother, Diane, was sitting on the edge of a custom leather sofa, her face buried in her hands, and sitting directly across from her was Harper, my golden child sister, still wearing the expensive silk dress she had worn to the family dinner 3 days ago, and her makeup was smeared across her cheeks. "Stop crying, Harper. Just stop," Richard snapped, his voice echoing cleanly through the phone's speaker. "It's done. The police have the ID, they have Diane's phone call. It's a closed loop. What if Maya tells them?" Harper sobbed, her voice a pathetic, trembling whine. She pulled her knees to her chest. What if she demands a lawyer? What if she proves she wasn't in the SUV? She was sleeping in her apartment. "Harper," Diane practically shouted, dropping her hands from her face. "She lives alone. She has no witnesses. It's her physical ID at the scene of a catastrophic wreck against her word. The police don't care about a data analyst claiming she was in bed. They care about physical evidence. By Monday morning, Han, a public defender, will force her to take a plea deal." Vance's jaw visibly clenched, the muscles in his neck strained against his collar. He was watching 3 wealthy, arrogant civilians casually narrate the exact mechanics of a federal conspiracy, completely unaware that the lead detective on the case was watching them live. "I had to use her license, Dad," Harper whispered, staring blankly at the fireplace. "If I get arrested for a felony DUI, the wedding is off. The Brooks family will cancel the engagement immediately. I'd lose everything." "You're not losing anything," Richard said, taking a long, arrogant swallow of his scotch. He walked over and placed a hand on Harper's shoulder. "Maya is strong. She's cold. She can survive a few years in a minimum security facility. Her career is already built. You need this marriage, Harper. We did what we had to do to protect the family. The police are probably booking her into a holding cell right now." I didn't smile. I didn't look at Vance for validation. I just watched the screen with the absolute freezing detachment of an executioner watching the trapdoor release. Vance didn't say a single word. He didn't need to. He slowly reached for the heavy black radio clipped to his shoulder harness. He unhooked it, pressed the transmission button, and brought it to his mouth. His eyes never left my phone screen. "Dispatch. This is Detective Vance. Priority 1, he growled, his voice a low, lethal rumble that filled the concrete box. "I need 4 patrol units and a tactical breach team deployed to Oak Brook Estates immediately. I have a live, uncoerced audiovisual confession for a felony hit-and-run, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The suspects are contained in the primary living room. Approach with silent sirens. Do not let them hear you coming. Copy that, Detective." The radio crackled back. "Units rolling." Vance lowered the radio. He looked at me, the cynical exhaustion completely gone from his face, replaced by a profound, almost terrifying level of respect. "Keep the feed running," Vance ordered softly. We sat in absolute silence for exactly 14 minutes. We watched Richard pour another drink. We watched Diane convince herself that sacrificing her eldest daughter was a necessary collateral damage for their social standing. We watched Harper stop crying and start scrolling through her wedding Pinterest board, the guilt completely evaporating from her sociopathic mind. Then, the ambient lighting on the video feed suddenly shifted. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of their living room, violent strobing flashes of red and blue light began to paint the walls. The police cruisers had cut their sirens, but the light bars were blinding. Richard froze. His scotch glass stopped halfway to his mouth. Diane stood up so fast she knocked over a side table. Harper dropped her phone onto the rug. "Richard," Diane whispered, her voice picked up flawlessly by the hidden microphone. "Richard, what is that?" "Nobody move," Richard commanded, his boardroom authority instantly shattering into pure, unadulterated panic. They didn't have time to move. They didn't have time to craft a lie, call a lawyer, or delete a single text message. The heavy, custom mahogany front door of the estate didn't just open when it exploded inward with a deafening, splintering crash. "Police! Search warrant! Show me your hands!" 6 heavily armed officers flooded into the living room feed, their tactical flashlights cutting through the amber glow. Harper let out a blood-curdling, hysterical scream as an officer grabbed her by the arm and slammed her face first into the custom leather sofa, ratcheting heavy steel cuffs around her wrists. "Get on the ground, do it now," an officer roared at Richard. My father, the man who had spent 30 years controlling every narrative and buying his way out of every consequence, didn't argue. He dropped to his knees, his hands trembling violently above his head, his face completely drained of blood. Diane was sobbing uncontrollably as an officer read her Miranda rights, the exact same rights I'd listened to on the freezing highway less than 2 hours ago. Vance exhaled a long, heavy breath. He reached across the steel table, took the small silver key from his pocket, and unlocked the iron cuff binding my right wrist. The heavy metal fell away with a clatter. "You're free to go, Maya," Vance said softly, standing up from the table. "I'll have an officer drive you back to your vehicle, and I will personally ensure your arrest record is expunged before sunrise." I picked up my smartphone, watching the live feed of my sister being dragged out of the house by her hair. I slipped the phone into my coat pocket. "Thank you, Detective," I said. I walked out of the interrogation room, leaving the door wide open behind me. 6 months later, the mother in the Honda Odyssey made a full recovery. Because the police had secured a flawless, recorded confession, my family's expensive defense attorneys were entirely useless. Harper was sentenced to a mandatory 8 years in a state penitentiary for felony hit and run resulting in severe bodily injury. The Brooks family canceled the wedding the morning after the arrest, publicly distancing themselves from the scandal. My parents didn't escape the blast radius. Richard and Diane were both convicted of federal obstruction of justice and conspiracy to commit perjury. To pay for their catastrophic legal fees, they were forced to liquidate the Oak Brook estate, their luxury vehicles, and Richard's retirement portfolios. They avoided prison time, but they were permanently bankrupted, forced to move into a tiny, rundown rental property in a neighboring state, where they tried to call me from a prepaid burner phone a few weeks after the trial, likely to beg for financial assistance or a shred of forgiveness. I didn't answer. I simply opened my corporate telecom portal, located the burner phone's exact geolocation, and permanently blacklisted the IMEI number from every cellular network on the eastern seaboard. Meanwhile, my logistics firm promoted me to Director of Data Architecture, complete with a corner office and a salary that guaranteed I would never have to look back. If your own parents and sister conspired to frame you for a felony to protect their social standing, would you have warned them that you had the data to prove your innocence? Or would you have sat in that interrogation room and watched the SWAT team kick their door down live on camera like I did? Well, let me know exactly how you would handle this betrayal in the comments below. If you love this story of absolute clinical justice, drop a like, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.